I'm delighted to be here. When we started our research at the University of Houston in the mid-1990s, religion wasn't even on the radar screen of immigration folk. The famous International Migration Encyclopedia had come out in 1994, and it didn't even have an index item for religion. So, and I think one of the reasons for this, I'm part of an immigration center at the University of Houston, and we know a lot about labor statistics of the immigrants. We know a lot about educational patterns. We know a lot about their migration patterns to the United States, but we knew nothing about their religious affiliations. And I think one reason for that is that a lot of immigration scholars rely on survey research. And a lot of the survey research is government-sponsored, from the Labor Department, the U.S. Census, Department of Education, and of course, as you know, we're not allowed to ask questions on religion. So religion was just not part of this whole research genre. We realized when we started this research in the early 90s that to get information on religious patterns of the new immigrants, we would have to do field research. We'd have to go out into the field and do more qualitatively oriented surveys to begin with. And that's precisely what we did. I would go to a lot of immigration conferences, and I'd be there for 2 or 3 days, and nobody even mentioned religion. So to have a conference like this on international migration with religion in the title is just wonderful. My colleague that I've done a lot of my research with and that I've co-published with died a very untimely death last summer. But Janet Chavitz would be absolutely delighted to know that I'm here at a conference on international migration that actually has religion in the title. So thank you, Susan. Comes first. Much of the migration literature prior to the last 2 decades presented immigrants as individuals who uprooted themselves from one society to settle and become incorporated into a new land. This earlier sociological research usually predicted that ethnic attachments would weaken and then fade as immigrants gradually became assimilated into the U.S. and American-born children reached maturity. Subsequent research, however, has shown that ethnicity remains salient for many immigrants, and that religion often serves as an identity marker that helps the immigrant to maintain an ethnic identity. And apparently this will be the focus of a lot of your next forum, which is wonderful. We now have clear evidence that many immigrants who invest socially, economically, and politically in the U.S. also continue to participate in the daily life of the society from which they immigrated. There was an article yesterday in the New York Times Magazine, some of you may have seen it, and it tells the story, for example, of a woman who calls home to the Philippines. This was the Philippines. And she makes approximately 3 telephone calls a day back home. I was interviewing a woman from the Dominican Republic at one point, and as I was interviewing her, the telephone rang. She answered it, and it was her mother in the Dominican Republic. Her little 2-year-old son had a sore throat, and the mother called her to say, "What kind of medicine would you like me to give him?" That's how the new immigrants are living transnationally. Let me make it clear that transnational migration did not begin with the new immigrants. We often raise the question, what's new about the new immigrants? The new immigrants are those migrants who have come to the United States since 1965, when we changed our immigration law. But it's very clear that immigrants had these transnational ties long before 1965. However, there is a new dimension to this transnationalism today. It's very different to get a letter from a home country 2 weeks after it was written, compared to the fact that the telephone rings and you can be involved instantaneously with family that you left behind in the home country. So transnationalism is very different today than it was in earlier waves of migration. Today, migrants often go back home for a long weekend without missing much work, and family from the homeland can readily come to the U.S. for a visit. Such ease of transportation facilitates the maintenance of transnational ties. While studies of transnationalism have increased in the past several decades, one dimension of the process has been virtually neglected, as I mentioned before, and that's the role of religion. Those of you that read this New York Times article yesterday may have been amazed to learn that there are 200 million migrants throughout the world today. That's the latest estimate. And they send home over $300 billion in economic remittances to the home country every year. That was the estimate in 2006. $300 billion. 5 years ago, we didn't even use the word remittances. People didn't even know what that meant. But with a couple of reports from the International Monetary Fund and from the World Bank in the last 5 years, we've become aware of how important these economic remittances really are in the home countries from which these migrants come. It's changing economies globally. Now, my argument is that we're having perhaps similar implications from what's going on with religious systems. And as happens so often, religion is sort of the stepchild, and it takes a while for us to begin to realize the kind of impact that religion has on global religious systems. And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit today. There were a few case studies prior to the mid-1990s that talked about transnational religious remittances. But basically, this was not on the radar screen. This lacuna in the transnational migration literature is what prompted us, with the financial support of the Pew Charitable Trust, to launch the Religion and Transnationalism Project in 1999. This project was an outgrowth of that earlier work we conducted, in which we interviewed members of these 13 congregations in Houston. In talking with immigrants about their daily lives and with congregational leaders about religious networks in their congregations, it was clear that religious beliefs and customs follow a circular path. And here's how it works. Initially, immigrants bring with them many religious practices from their home country, which they subsequently adapt to their lives in the United States. In fact, it is well documented now that immigrant religious groups over time take on the congregational characteristics of American religion. This includes things like congregational structure, voluntary membership, lay leadership, expansion of services, organizational networks, scheduling formal religious services, usually at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, unheard of in the home countries. Adapting ways of worship to American norms, and many of them even registering as a 501c3, tax-exempt organization, unheard of in their home countries. So the immigrants bring religious systems from the home country, adapt them in the United States, and then what happens over time is that many of those adaptations they transport back to their home countries. When immigrant congregations are first founded, influence and resources typically flow from the nation of origin to the new country. Religious practices are imported because immigrant practitioners want to reconstruct their traditional ways of doing religion. Because clergy often come from abroad, and sometimes because of strict hierarchical structures of religious authority. Over time, as immigrants adapt to their new environment and both they and their religious institutions acquire more financial stability, flows of monetary resources, religious personnel, and influence often reverse, or at least become two-way. And of course, this is expedited by modern means of communication and forms of travel. Email, websites, fax, audio and videotapes, phones, and air travel. As migrants communicate with family and friends left behind in their homelands, they influence religious structures and practices there. Not only does this reciprocal pattern change religious customs in the immigrants' countries of origin, but it prepares future migrants for what awaits them in religious institutions in the United States or wherever they migrate throughout the world. And it changes religious systems globally. The cost involved in conducting field studies cross-nationally prohibited our returning to the home countries of all 13 congregations. We selected 5 of them. As I said before, we had a research team in Beijing, in Ho Chi Minh City, in the highlands of Guatemala, in Mendoza, Argentina, in 2 settings in Mexico, and 1 in Fuzhou, China. Those were our 7 research sites where we looked at the impact of these transnational ties. We started with leads from the Houston community, and then I sent a team of researchers into the home community, back in the homeland, for 2 or 3 months. And they focused on changes in religious practices there that were created by returned migrants to the homelands. Let me talk now about some general patterns that we found. I'll give a few examples from Argentina. Argentine Brethren immigrants and the church they established sent money to the pastor of the Mendoza congregation from which they came. And in later years, they financially supported Brethren missions and retreat centers in a number of locations in Argentina, as well as in Honduras and Spain. I'll never forget being in that church in Argentina, in Mendoza, Argentina, and the pastor was complaining that financial contributions had plummeted, and he was worried about the future of his church. And a migrant from Houston said, "Reverend, why don't you pass the basket like they do in Houston, Texas? People will be embarrassed, and collections will go up." He started passing the basket, and within 3 weeks, his contributions went up 4-fold. So that's just one very small example. In Vietnam, we walked into a Buddhist temple in Ho Chi Minh City, and people were kneeling on red cushions, and we heard Amazing Grace being adapted to Vietnamese. Incredible what you see going on in these home communities, encouraged by these returned migrants. And one of the big things that's happening has to do with roles of women. Sisters and mothers from the United States returning and saying, "You mean women can't participate at all? Here's what we do in Houston, Texas." And all of a sudden, the women are saying to their pastors or to their lead monks, "This is what our fellow migrants are doing in the United States. Why can't we do that here?" So we see the roles of women in these churches and temples and mosques changing dramatically as a result of these return patterns. Also, the exportation from Houston congregations of material objects, pews, designer furniture, pianos, organs, and religious norms, such as congregations providing secular services, such as social services, as well as worship services, unheard of in these home countries. All of a sudden, these migrants are beginning to offer food to the needy and clothing and job counseling, as we do in many churches in the United States, in temples and mosques, but unheard of in the home country until these migrants began to talk about it. One of the things we suggest in our work is that U.S. immigrant congregations become influential actors in other nations because of the core country status of the U.S. and the kinds of resources and experiences that immigrants in a wealthy nation can amass. Capitalizing on the strengths of the core country, immigrants can, in turn, exert economic, political, social, cultural, and religious influences on their communities of origin. Because of the selectivity of U.S. immigration laws since 1965, a large portion of the contemporary immigrant population is composed of highly educated professionals, political refugees, and intellectual exiles who are considered elites in their home country. As I have to remind my students down in Houston, Texas, repeatedly, not every immigrant is poor and undocumented and unskilled. We're so used to the Mexican migrants into the Southwest that sometimes we forget that we also have an equally large population of highly skilled, highly educated migrants. And many of these people are considered elite professionals in their home country. So when they speak, they're listened to. Contemporary immigrants are also concentrated in metropolitan areas where cultural pluralism and cosmopolitanism are part of their everyday lives. Their transnational connections with their home countries, facilitated by advanced technologies of communication, transportation, and material wealth, are an important stream of globalization. Therefore, the power and influence of the core country in the world system, the tangible and intangible resources of these new immigrants, and the social, cultural, and religious experiences of their living in pluralistic America are forces that together provide necessary conditions for contemporary immigrants to exert influence within their global religious systems. Immigrants and their congregations often gain considerable social prestige in the home community and elsewhere, and thus a heightened influence on beliefs and practices there and wherever future immigrants migrate. Another interesting thing that's happening, some immigrant religious communities are shifting their worldwide organizational centers to the United States. Incredible. Many immigrant religions have their holy centers in other parts of the world. When people immigrate, they often move away from the foundational or social historical centers of their religion. However, immigrants in the U.S., the core country in the contemporary world system, possess rich resources, including material wealth, advanced technologies, organizational skills, and live in one of the world's most advanced societies. Therefore, American immigrant communities are in a powerful position to exert influence in their countries of origin, and possibly in other parts of the world as well. For an example, in the year 2000, we had the worldwide Zoroastrian conference in Houston. We can't be the center of Zoroastrianism because that fire that exists in these Zoroastrian temples cannot be transported across the water. So we don't have official Zoroastrian centers in the United States. However, the Houston community of Zoroastrians is exerting a very strong influence throughout the world. It's probably the center of Zoroastrianism right now on a lot of measures. Likewise, while Mecca remains the holy place for Muslims worldwide, the American Muslim community is taking worldwide leadership in developing youth organizations across sectarian divides, in relocating Bosnian Muslims after the Serbian conflict, and in establishing mosques that incorporate Muslims across ethnic, national, and religious lines. Of course, is this going to last? The big question is always the second generation. Anytime you talk about immigration, that's the big issue. Will the second generation maintain these kind of transnational ties? There's some evidence on both sides of that question. It's too early to tell because many of the second generation are just now in college and starting their own families. So we'll have to see what happens in the long run. So I think I'll stop there, and then I'm sure we'll have some questions later on. The book that Dr. Chavitz and I published out of this is called Religion Across Borders. And it's in that book that we outline a lot of the findings from our study of these 7 communities. Thank you.
Migration has become so global that our discussion today is not properly limited to the so-called traditional migration countries like the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Argentina. The old world, or even old Europe, have become migration destinations and now play a major role in the creation of these transnational religious communities. According to the UN World Migration Stock, there are 191 million migrants in the world. Of those, 86 million are economically active. Combined, Australia, New Zealand, and the Americas host only 30% of these active migrants. 33% are now in Europe, and 29% are in Asia and the Middle East. My talk addresses a much smaller subset of these migrants, the 9 million souls who are forced migrants, who are refugees and asylum seekers, the 9 million who have fled persecution. Transnational immigrant networks facilitate the participation of migrants in their home and their host societies. For refugees, this participation is different. Refugees may find a home in, contribute to, or even establish religious communities in the host country. In many cases, refugees must flee with only the clothes on his back and the faith in his heart. Any effort to continue to participate back home may be dangerous, which is why the refugee left in the first place. More than participating in the religious communities which they left behind, refugees tend to be more focused on the protection or rescue and relocation of their communities of origin and bringing them to safety. I wanted to give my part of this discussion a truly international focus. I have, however, slipped into concentrating on the national consciousness of the United States as a haven for those who have fled religious persecution and the impact which this has had on U.S. foreign policy in general and on refugee policy in particular. To this day, religious communities in the United States continue to influence U.S. foreign policy in general and human rights and refugee policy in particular, in order to connect with their co-religionists in other countries. They do this in a way which, it seems to me, is uniquely American. The American national myth as a refuge of religious freedom is certainly well grounded in history. Jonathan Winthrop, in his 1629 explanation of the need for the Puritans to sail across the sea from England to settle in North America, wrote that God hath provided this place to be a refuge for many whom he means to save out of the general calamity, and seeing the church hath no place left to fly into but the wilderness, what better work can there be than to go and provide tabernacles and food for her? Winthrop's Puritans were preceded by the Pilgrims, and even before the founding of the United States were succeeded by the Huguenots, the Quakers, the Waldenses, the Mennonites, the Amish, Catholics, and Jews. These groups found refuge here in the United States before the United States was even established. By that time, as evidenced in George Washington's 1790 letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, George Washington said, "It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that have enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens." Not all immigration to the United States has been in order to flee religious freedom. In fact, during the biggest immigration waves of the 19th century, much of it was to flee economic plight and to find a better life. But nonetheless, the United States has been seen as the golden Medina for those who have been persecuted on basis of religion. Nor was the United States the first or the only polity to provide refuge to persecuted religious minorities. Polities have been doing this since biblical times, and the Bible is basically a history of persecution, flight, dispersion, and refuge. Nor does the United States have an unblemished record of providing refuge to those who have fled religious persecution. As my agency, HIAS, knows firsthand, the United States did not distinguish itself during the Holocaust as a refuge for the persecuted. Nor does the United States government instinctively offer asylum and refugee status to religious minorities fleeing persecution. Iraqi Christians today, for example, are now fleeing their country by the tens or even hundreds of thousands, and the United States so far has done little to offer them refuge in spite of strong advocacy efforts by the Chaldean American community and others. What is uniquely American, however, is that the religious communities of the United States have so internalized the national myth of the role of the United States as a beacon for the persecuted that this has become embedded in the perspective of the communities themselves. This perspective shapes their relationship with their co-religionists overseas and with the United States government. In many instances, ultimately, it also shapes U.S. policy. This beacon consciousness and the particular attention paid to religious communities fleeing persecution is further enhanced by the strength of religious communities and religion in the United States. You may be familiar with recent surveys by the Pew Global Attitudes Project, released in 2002, and a survey 10 years earlier, released by the National Opinion Research Center, the 1991 Survey International Social Survey Program, both of which concluded that the United States stands alone in terms of its religiosity among industrialized countries. When it comes to a number of indicators that indicate the religiosity of a society, the United States is more akin to many developing countries and is separate and apart from more secular industrialized countries in the rest of the world. Nowhere is this more evident than in the U.S. refugee resettlement program, particularly as it has existed since the passage of the Refugee Act of 1980. First, I need to dispel a myth about the U.S. refugee resettlement program, and this myth is a false one. This myth is probably traceable to the false assumption that the United States gives refuge to anyone who needs it. The refugee resettlement myth has been perpetuated by Hollywood over the years to such an extent that in the course of the government study on asylum which I directed, we encountered many immigration inspectors and even immigration judges who believe it. This myth is that if someone overseas is being persecuted, all he or she needs to do is walk into an American embassy and apply for political asylum. In reality, only foreigners within the United States may apply for political asylum. Those overseas may apply for refugee status. While U.S. embassies do have the authority to refer an applicant for refugee status for consideration by the Department of Homeland Security, this is seldom done, and it's seldom done for very practical reasons. Obviously, if every U.S. embassy accepted every application for individuals suffering from persecution, the embassies would be overwhelmed and wouldn't be able to function. As a result, this happens very, very seldom. Rather, it's only a slight exaggeration to say that participation in the U.S. refugee program is really by invitation only. Religious communities in the United States have succeeded in working with and shaping U.S. refugee and foreign policy to ensure that their co-religionists overseas will have some access to the U.S. refugee program. Unlike the transnational religious networks which we are talking about for migrants, this transnational tie has less to do with ethnicity, I believe, but more to do with the commonality of religion. And I'll just briefly mention the ways to access the U.S. refugee program today are, first and foremost, the UNHCR referral, a referral from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees indicating that you need resettlement and you should be resettled to the United States, or a referral, as I said, by the U.S. Embassy. Both of those are quite difficult to get, although right now I believe the majority of referrals are now made to the United States by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. The other priority, the other way to gain access to the U.S. refugee program is for the State Department to designate you as a group of particular humanitarian concern, a so-called Priority 2 group. And then there's the family reunion cases, the Priority 3 group, where individuals from certain countries with close family ties can reunite with relatives in the United States. In all of these cases, you do have to claim and establish that you have a well-founded fear of persecution in your country of origin. But in terms of the group access program, which I had mentioned, the Priority 2 access, there's currently only three groups that are eligible for this access. No, four groups. One are Jews and evangelicals from the former Soviet Union who are still eligible to apply directly to the U.S. refugee program. The second is Iranian religious minorities who can also apply directly to the U.S. refugee program without a referral. The third would be Cubans who can apply in country, and among the Cubans who may apply is specifically mentioned members of religious minorities. And then finally, Vietnamese are also able to apply through this direct category in country. All others must get a referral to the U.S. refugee program. Now, it's interesting that of these categories, two are completely religious or community-oriented, and the third also has a religious tie to it. And I wanted to briefly discuss that because it didn't happen easily. And the way it happened is really due to so much advocacy by the religious communities in the United States. I'd like to talk about the group I know most about, or my organization knows most about, the Jews from the former Soviet Union. The perception, and not an entirely inaccurate one, about the American Jewish community is that its major foreign policy motivator has been protection of the State of Israel. This is largely true, but there has been one major exception, and that exception relates to America's role, again, as a beacon for the persecuted. While a great deal has been published on the subject, preserving the United States as a beacon for persecuted co-religionists is so important to the American Jewish community that at times its preservation, the preservation of this beacon by the American Jewish community has caused significant conflict and confrontation between the American Jewish community and the State of Israel. Israel was, of course, founded as a state for religious refugees, and the national consciousness of Israel is that it is a place, it is the place for Jewish migrants to go. It is their home. At HIAS, we don't generally like to talk about this conflict, but this story has been told in numerous works, the latest of which is The Struggle for Soviet Jewry in American Politics, Israel versus the American Jewish Establishment by Fred Lazine. And indeed, when you look at the Soviet Jewry movement, it's remarkable as to how central a role this beacon consciousness of the American Jewish community played. You may be familiar with the movement where the Jackson-Vanik Amendment of 1975, which was, again, pushed very hard by the American Jewish community, tied most favored nation status for the Soviet Union, not to religious freedom, but to their immigration policies, largely to the treatment of Soviet Jews. But to the American Jewish community, it wasn't enough that the Jews were able to go to Israel from the former Soviet Union. Rather, significant efforts were made by the American Jewish community to keep the door open to the United States. Freedom of emigration to the American Jewish community meant emigration to anywhere, to the United States or to Israel. But the American Jewish community believed in Yogi Berra's expression that when you come to a fork in the road, you should take it. They insisted on creating a fork in the road for Jews fleeing the Soviet Union so that Jews would have a choice whether they first come to the Jewish state, Israel, or the land of religious freedom, the United States. From the 1970s until the present, the American Jewish community had many opportunities to please Israel by conceding U.S. policy decisions or actions which would have limited the choice of Soviet Jews to immigrate to the United States. Each time, the American Jewish community advocated for the U.S. to change its policy or even its law to keep the golden door open to their co-religionists from the Soviet Union so that they would have the choice about whether to go to Israel or the United States. And in fact, the numbers were quite substantial. Before 1990, of Soviet Jews who fled the Soviet Union, 240,000 went to Israel, but more than 200,000 went to the United States. Since 1990, 226,000 more have come to the United States, although that number has been exceeded by the numbers to Israel, which is now at 581,000. The American Jewish community has not been alone in this. There are approximately 150,000 evangelical Soviets and former Soviets have also immigrated under this program. And again, the evangelical community in the United States faced a similar dilemma, whether their co-religionists should stay in their country and should promote their beliefs there and should promote the gospel there, or whether they should have the freedom to leave themselves and worship as they please. But they too were included in this mass migration. And then in 1989, when the Immigration and Naturalization Service started to deny a significant number of refugee applications from Soviet Jews and evangelicals in Rome, the American Jewish community reacted not by throwing up its hands and saying, well, those who are denied can go to Israel, but rather by compelling Congress or advocating with Congress to change the law and to change the standard of adjudication of the refugee standard through the Lautenberg Amendment for this population. So as a result, again, that kept the door open. And then when Rome became overwhelmed and Italy became overwhelmed with tens of thousands of migrants from the former Soviet Union, and it was decided that door had to be closed and direct flights began from Israel, from Moscow to Israel, Once again, the American Jewish community, rather than just saying, okay, Soviet Jews should go to Israel, said we should keep the freedom of choice, we should keep the door open, and advocated that at least those with close family in the United States be allowed to continue to emigrate through the refugee program. And the Lautenberg Amendment remains in place even today, renewed each year, and Soviet Jews continue to emigrate, albeit in much smaller numbers, to the United States through this program. A similar episode has happened with Iranian Armenian Christians who come to the U.S. through Priority 2, through Vienna, and Iranian Jews, Iranian Baha'i, all join their co-religionists in the United States through this program. When a similar phenomenon happened around 2001 and the Immigration Service started to deny that caseload, those communities rose up and expanded the Lautenberg Amendment, the lower adjudication standard that was in effect for Soviet Jews and evangelicals, to also apply for Iranian religious minorities. But the impact of this Golden Medina or of this beacon mentality has not been limited to the U.S. refugee program. It's also expanded to other foreign policy areas. In 1998, the Congress passed the International Religious Freedom Act in spite of very lukewarm support and actually originally opposition by the Clinton administration, who felt that the International Religious Freedom Act would be an infringement upon their ability to exercise foreign policy. The Congress passed this act by a vote. I believe there were of 98 to 0 in the Senate, and the vote was almost as lopsided, though not quite, in the House. In this act, it begins by saying, "The right to freedom of religion undergirds the very origin and existence of the United States. Many of our nation's founders fled religious persecution abroad, cherishing in their hearts and minds the ideal of religious freedom. They established in law as a fundamental right and as a pillar of our nation the right to freedom of religion. From its birth to this day, the United States has prized this legacy of religious freedom and honored this heritage by standing for religious freedom and offering refuge to those suffering religious persecution." And what this act did was it established religious freedom as being a major priority for U.S. foreign policy, required that the United States write a human rights report specifically on religious freedom for every country in the world, and that it implement sanctions against those countries who are the worst violators. It also included a number of provisions to improve the refugee program. And again, all of it comes from this same beacon mentality, the same beacon consciousness, this national myth. Just to close by noting that the group today, the Soviet Jews of today that are now pushing to impact U.S. Refugee policy would probably be the Chaldean American community, the Iraqi Christians, who have substantial communities in Detroit and a smaller one in San Diego and Chicago. There are approximately 90,000 Chaldeans in Detroit who have emigrated to the United States over the last century, starting with a group in 1910 that came to work in the auto industry. But while Chaldeans, who are Catholic, Iraqi Catholics, make up only 3% of the population of Iraq, of the more than 2 million refugees who have been fleeing Iraq since the beginning of the intervention there, more than 40% of the refugees who are registered with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees have been Chaldeans. So in spite of the fact that they're only 3% of the population, more than 40% are Chaldeans. And they're fleeing repeated church bombings. They've been targeted in kidnappings. Many of them own liquor stores. Because they're non-Muslims, they're allowed to own liquor stores, and those have been blown up. Chaldean women have find themselves being forced to wear the hijab, and there have been a number of incidents where those who do not have had acid thrown in their faces. So they're fleeing in large droves. It's largely because they're facing religious persecution, not by the Iraqi government, but by forces that the Iraqi government is unable to control. Right now, the U.S. refugee program has not established any access specific for this group, like it has for Soviet Jews or Iranian religious minorities. but it's not for lack of trying by the Chaldean American community. U.S. refugee program did just announce that it will accept up to 7,000 Iraqis this year in terms of referrals from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which has identified the Chaldeans as being one of the vulnerable groups. But as America has always been a sanctuary for those persecuted due to their religious belief, I think that it's just a matter of time before the Chaldeans too join those groups that are being benefited, that are able to affect the U.S. refugee program. Thank you.
I don't know if many have had the chance to really look at the paper, if it's been updated, but I'm basically going to focus on the plight of Hindus in Bangladesh and to the extent that I can in Kashmir, their plight, their policy, and their demographic implications. The reason I'm touching on this, especially on Bangladesh, is it's comes very close to my heart. Not only the fact that I'm a Hindu, but because of the fact that my family has directly suffered. And we have been forcefully migrated to India since '47, simply because of the fact that in a country, when India was divided in 1947, it was divided into two sections, with the Hindu majority being India and the Muslim majority being in East Pakistan and West Pakistan. West Pakistan now is the current state of Pakistan as we see it, and East Pakistan is what we see it is now Bangladesh. East Pakistan was created after the Indo-Pakistan War of 1971, when the Bengali population felt as though they were being marginalized by the Punjabi and Urdu-speaking population majority in what is now Pakistan itself, West Pakistan. The extent of the brutality of what had happened there is pretty large. Let me just read you a quote from a book that we publish annually, and I'm just going to hold it up for the audience. It's called Hindus in South Asia and the Diaspora, A Survey of Human Rights, 2006. It's an annual book we publish on the plight of Hindus around the world where there's religious persecution. An example is in the creation of Bangladesh, there was a massacre of an estimated 2 million Pakistani citizens and an ethnic cleansing of nearly 10 million, mainly Hindus, who had fled from what is now Bangladesh to India. In the summary in his report, Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts, in November 1st, 1971, stated, "Field reports to the U.S. government, countless eyewitness journalistic accounts, reports to international agencies such as the World Bank, and additional information available to the subcommittee document the reign of terror which groups East Pakistan. Hardest hit have been members of the Hindu community who've been robbed of their lands and shops, systematically slaughtered, and in some places painted yellow patches with the word H. All of this has been officially sanctioned, ordered, and implemented under the martial law from Islamabad." It's surprising that in 1947, 31% of Bangladesh's population was Hindu. In 1961, the population was 19%. In 1974, the population was 14%. And in 2002, the population was 10%, and it's decreasing day by day. And what had affected me most was in 1971, as the war was going on, my mom lives in a state called Bihar, which borders what is the state of West Bengal in India. And she had recounted that one day she was going to the train station with her father. And as she was going there, she saw trainloads of what? Refugees coming in from Bangladesh, Hindus, with no arms, breasts slashed, severed hands, severed legs, and with the word H branded on their bodies to identify themselves as Hindus. And she had said when she went home that night, she had seen a lady, they lived very close to the train station, she had seen a lady who had come in, and she had pretty much gone mad. She had a beautiful sari, which was then ripped. She had her feetless her shoes were, she had no longer shoes, her feet were bleeding, her hair was disheveled, and she was running around screaming, "Save me, save me." So when my grandfather took her in and asked her what had happened, it took her quite a long time to regain her consciousness and tell the story of the fact that she lived in a village bordering West Bengal in Bangladesh, and her husband was a doctor. Her father-in-law was a doctor, and one day her husband went to the local pond to fetch some water, and he never came back. So when they went to look out for the husband, they found his dead body lying in a pool of water. And a few days later, when she was feeding her small child, who was about 3 years old, the local Muslim population in the area came, and they forcibly snatched the child from her hand and threw them into a local bonfire. And the bonfire was basically a bonfire of Hindu children. And she had managed to escape somehow and flee to India. And then my family clothed her and bathed her and took her to the local temple, which had opened a lot of refugee camps for the Hindus that were coming there. Now, this is not an isolated incident that happened in '71, but is still going on today. And it's been pretty much sanctioned by the government. For example, when when 1971 war was happening, the Pakistan government introduced what was called the Vested Property Return Bill, which was renamed the Enemy Property Act. And what the Enemy Property Act basically stated was an enemy was defined as a Hindu who had left Bangladesh, and if he had left Bangladesh, he was no longer entitled to his land, or any land that he may have, even though he may have the deeds to the land and it may be in his family for centuries. So essentially, if you leave a country, you're no longer there. You're not existent in the government anymore. And my family had suffered because my father's side lived in an area called Chowdhury in Bangladesh. And just before, when they had found out that India was being partitioned, my grandfather realized that he would not be able to live there because as it is, they were being highly discriminated against. So we've basically lost not only lots of land, we've lost lots of relatives in the process, because during the point of migration, pretty much a good majority of my father's side died because of this persecution that was going on. And unfortunately, even though this Vested Enemy Property Act was started by the Pakistan government, it has still to date not been repealed by the current Bangladesh government. And it's estimated here that 10 out of every 34 Hindu families in Bangladesh have suffered, nearly 30% have suffered because of this Property Act. And it is still continuing, and despite which government can come in, it's not doing anything about it. Another is that when Bangladesh was created, its constitution stated that it would be adopted on nationalism, secularism, socialism, and democracy. But in phases, in '77 and '88, the constitution was changed, making Islam the state religion and pretty much denying any other faith the right to really practice their religion freely. And the reason I'm stating this is because I'm originally from New York City, and I'm a Bengali, and I can tell you that in the area of New York City where I live, there is a high concentration of Bangladeshi Hindus that are living there. And they're living there because they are refugees, the majority of whom can be found in the Bronx and in Queens. And they're living there because they don't want to come to the United States. I do not think any person who is living very well has quite a bit of education. Most of these people are not, high school graduates. They're most, have master's degrees or doctors or PhDs. But they're coming here and they're working as construction workers. They're working as taxi drivers because they've come here as political asylum refugees. And they've come here because they're seeking religious freedom. And it's sad to say that even though this is going on, pretty much the world is pretty silent about it. For example, last year in our report, we've documented 480 incidents of persecution towards Hindus, anything from kidnap, threatening of journalists, to the looting of temples, murders, forcible conversion, to the rape of children as young as 6 years old. And it's having a trend, not because of the fact that the population of Bangladesh is declining, but because of the fact that there is a rise of radical Wahhabi Islam that's coming in. Most of the people that import Wahhabi Islam are guest workers who go to Saudi Arabia or Middle Eastern countries, and then they come back to Bangladesh after the guest worker permit is over, and they bring back with them this radical form of Islam. For example, Charles Tannock, the Vice President of the Human Rights Subcommittee in the European Parliament, stated on July 21st, 2005, that there has been a total of roughly 64,000 madrasas, Islamic seminaries, that are operating under the fundamentalist Deobandi Islam in Bangladesh. And the Deobandi Islam is another sect of Wahhabi Islam that most of us are very much familiar with. So now we have to really look at the fact that not only is there demographic implications, but also as of how's it affecting foreign policy. It's the fact that you're seeing that Bangladeshi Hindus are declining, but You're seeing a rise in radical Islam in an area that was tolerant about 100 years ago. And now that the U.S. is fighting the war on terror in Afghanistan and other parts of the country, does it really have to change its focus and look at the other parts of the world where there is a rise in fundamentalist Islam? And that's something that we really have to take into account. And the other thing that we're closely working on is that we're working with organizations such as the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, who I'm sure Mark will be able to tell you a lot about. But we're actually working with them, and we've been working with them for the past 3 years explaining the situation of Hindus there. And in November of last year, they actually had a press briefing on Capitol Hill, which we were invited to attend, and they actually issued a policy brief on Bangladesh. Bangladesh is currently going through its next election cycle, and they issued a policy brief because they realized that fact that the religious situation of not only Hindus, but other minorities such as Christians is really in peril there. And it's just directly one effect of the areas that we're doing. We're obviously working with other agencies such as the State Department to bring them, more into light of what's going on there. If anyone has ever seen the State Department report, all this that's going on, the plummeting in population from 31 to 9% about, is written off in about 2 to 3 lines. There's not much written about this mass migration or the persecution that's going on and the global effects of it. And this is something that we are constantly letting them know through not only our press releases, but reports such as these. And it's something that every one of us can really take into account when we look at foreign policy in total. Because foreign policy is not only about immigration, but also on what's going on globally and how it's going to affect us in every single way. And we have to really ask ourselves, can we really afford to have another Iraq? Can we really afford to have another Afghanistan in a part of the country that is now still somewhat stable? And I think I should be able to end with that. If anybody has any questions,
let me share with you a few
Thank
examples for the topic of today, which is the link between religion, migration, and foreign policy, and based on the experience with Islam, mainly in Germany, but elsewhere in Europe as well. The Danish cartoons crisis is such a good example for a local event, an event in one country where a national newspaper, as you all know, printed the caricatures about the Prophet Muhammad. From there it went to Egypt because of the Muslim organizations there who brought it to Egypt in order to make some outrage there. And from there it went to the Muslim world, and it came back to Europe with events, as I'm sure you followed in UK and in a few other countries in the European Union. So this is a good example for how globalization involved the linkage between religion, sending countries, receiving countries, and the debate about integration. Another very important debate which we're having right now, particularly in Germany, but as well in the countries like Denmark or like the Netherlands and like Belgium, is the debate about Alawi identity. It's a classical debate of diaspora. It did not start in Turkey, it started in Germany, where the headquarters of the Alawi umbrella organization is, followed by other countries. And it was a debate about whether Alawis belong to Islam or do not belong to Islam. And it went all the way from Europe, from Germany, back into Turkey. But it didn't start in Turkey. In Turkey, there was never such a big discussion about whether that's the case or not. It's an interesting debate how discussions go back to the country where people came from. Another example is because Muslims are now living in European countries, that the state has the request to have some kind of dialogue partner. So in a way, in countries like Germany, Muslim organizations which are very diverse, which are not united, which are divided under the lines of the countries where they came from, under the lines of ethnic roots or religious roots, are now forced to come together because it's easier for the state to have one umbrella organization to talk to. What happens is that in a way, the Muslims are forced to organize themselves alongside the Christian churches, which is not a very usual thing how Muslims used to be organized. So again, the question raises in Germany, how strong should be the role, for instance, of Turkey? because the biggest organization of Muslims in Germany and in those countries where you have Turkish migration of Muslims from Turkey, of Sunni Muslims from Turkey, is DİTİB, which is a state-funded organization linked to the Ministry of Religious Affairs in Turkey. So should they have a say at all? Shouldn't they have a say? If they have a say, should they have the monopoly, which for a long time Turkey asked for, or should they share it with other organizations? So this is an important debate which is currently taking place. Again, the next question is, the request from Turkey for a long time was, if there is any kind of religious instruction, it should be in Turkish. But shouldn't it be in the language of the people of the country in which they live? So this is just to show you the different effects of this discussion with the sending country, with the receiving country, and the people from these countries living in the migrant countries right now. Another important aspect of the discussion is the change of perceptions that we're going through in foreign, domestic, and media policy towards, I would describe it as a kind of Muslimization. What I mean with that is, when I started to make politics, usually when you wanted to have a discussion with those strange others, you invited somebody from a union, you invited somebody from a parents' organization. Today you have dialogue with Muslim organizations. Everybody who wants to have dialogue invites somebody from the next mosque. So it has completely shifted from unions, from other kinds of organizations, sports organizations, into mosques. So the main dialogue partner today is the mosque and those people who are organized in mosques. Having said that, there is nothing wrong with that, but it's an interesting observation that it goes from one extreme, that Islam did not exist in the past, to the other extreme, that it's now only Islam that is existing. And there was a time when we were portrayed as leftists, as rightists, as liberals, as greens, as gays, lesbians, as heterosexuals, as whatever, soccer fans, and so on. And now we're reduced to a single identity, single-dimensional identity, which is Islam, which is a very interesting observation which is taking place right now. And to conclude, it's also very interesting to see that the US State Department, in its policy of the young leaders programs of the State Department, bringing people from Europe over to the US, it has completely shifted into a program of bringing Muslims over to the US. I recently had a conference in Berlin, and I was the moderator, and I knew a lot of people sitting in the plenary and listening to the discussion. And most of the people I recognized from different Islam organizations have been in the US in the last 3-4 years. So it's a very interesting situation that the US suddenly thinks that only Muslims are living in Germany. I mean, I don't have any problems with bringing Muslims over, but I feel in a way obliged as a secular Muslim to tell the US, well, there are other people in Germany as well, not only Muslims live in Germany, that would love to come to the US and would love to get an invitation. And the recent example I would like to share with you was when Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice was in Berlin. She invited to have a breakfast with Muslim leaders. I was one of the Muslim leaders being there. And I asked myself, since when I'm a Muslim leader? Because when I was elected, I didn't run as a Muslim leader. I run as everybody would run in a constituency. I run as a Green politician, as a center-left politician, whatever you want to describe it, but I did not run certainly as a Muslim leader, as my colleagues did not run as Christian leaders, who happen to be Christians. And I looked around in that circle of people who were invited by Secretary of State, and I would say half of them, you know, I asked, what makes you a Muslim leader? I mean, did you study that? You know, do you mainly address Muslims? Do you reach out to Muslim communities? It's not the case. So it's just an observation I want to share with you. We might have time to discuss that, whether that's a good thing or whether that's going towards, again, from one extreme to the other extreme. As you can hear, I have my question marks. The first time I was invited from Secretary of State was to discuss about foreign policy. And I was invited as a politician. The second time, as I said, as a Muslim leader. So I asked myself, the third time,
if it's still the same Secretary of State, what I will be invited as with which title it will be, what will be then the fashion in the Secretary of State at that time. I would have rather preferred to talk about foreign policy of the US, because I think there's a lot to say when it comes to the question of how Islam is perceived and how we can all together work against fundamentalism and extremism. And there I would have liked to talk about problems of human rights abuses and those kinds of things, because I think that's even more important to discuss than reducing the problem of currently from the US, that there is a problem of integrating Muslims in Europe, and the US has to address that in order to secure itself. I can understand that, especially when you look back from 9/11 and the Hamburg cell. But let's be very clear with that. This was not a problem of Muslim migrants living in Germany and living in Europe. That's completely mixed up and it's completely overseen. That was a problem of not homegrown Muslims in Europe. It was a problem of people coming to study there, misusing those opportunities and doing these horrible terrorist attacks. But we should be very careful not to mix up things. Thank you.
Well, I'll begin with the last speaker, since that's freshest in our minds. Can you hear me? Is this on? Since you're a member of the EU Parliament, I don't want to let this opportunity pass without asking you about what you consider sort of the mood of the EU Parliament right now regarding the Turkish question of membership in the EU. And especially, I guess this is very much on my mind, we just had a big conference in Texas a couple of weeks ago on the Armenian question, in which Turks and Armenians tried to meet together and talk about the issue. And it's so obvious that there are two different perspectives on it. And I'm wondering how much that Armenian question plays a part in the discussions in the EU in terms of membership of Turkey.
And actually, let me ask an added-on thing to that, Jim, and that's to what extent is the projections about migration from Turkey playing into the debate within the European Union?
Excuse me, that was integration?
To what extent is the prospects for immigration from Turkey playing into the debate about membership in the EU?
Shall I respond immediately? Please. Thanks. Well, first of all, to just explain you the framework, the decision to start negotiations, which is sometimes overseen with Turkey about membership, was made by all the member states together. So it was not a majority decision. It was a decision shared by all the member states, because you can only start negotiations if everybody agrees. And sometimes you get the impression, you know, that some states were absent or were drunk or something like that. I mean, the Austrians and the French and everybody supported that decision, including all the commissioners. You know, you cannot have a decision about starting negotiation with half of the commissioners against the other half. That's impossible. So that's important. And also in the parliament, we had a almost two-thirds majority to start negotiations with Turkey. So anonymous support in the Commission, anonymous support in the Council, and a two-thirds majority in the Parliament. I'm saying this in order to understand the current situation, because today you get a feeling something must have happened because it turned completely. The public perception is a very negative one. That's for sure. If you would do an opinion poll, and there are some opinion polls in some of the member states, you have a clear rejection of the idea of Turkey joining the European Union. Also, that is in a way mirrored in Turkey, because the more you have skepticism in Europe, the more you receive skepticism in Turkey. Not because people are against membership in the European Union, but because they make it a question of honor that has to do with, you know, Ottoman Empire. They want to be treated special, you know. We're not Malta, you know, it's a big country, how can you treat us like that? And there is this feeling of whatever we do, they will never take us. So that, in a way, is the current situation right now. Still, there is a majority, but it is clear that because of the elections in Turkey and because of the leadership problem in the European side, the problem with the Constitution Treaty, the elections in France, it looks like 2007 will be a year where not a lot of things happen. And not to talk too long about it, but of course Cyprus plays a very important role. I think this was the turning point in a way, because the ideal expectation, maybe a little bit naive, but that was the expectation from both sides, Turkey and the European Union, was Cyprus gets solved, gets reunited, joins the European Union reunited, and then Turkey has one very important stone out of the way and can continue with reforms in other areas. But then the catastrophe happened. The Greek Cypriots said no. Only the Greek Cypriot side entered the European Union and now has the veto right inside the European Union. So the negotiations, in a way, are now going for Nicosia and not for Brussels. And that's the current problem. With the Armenian question, well, it plays certainly a very important role. You have in countries like France, but as well in Belgium and in the Netherlands, in Germany, permanent discussions about the Armenian genocide. You have parliamentary decisions, sometimes tougher, sometimes less tough. The German decision was certainly not as tough as the French decision. The wording was very mild compared to the French decision. But then you have a new step which was entered 2 years ago maybe. And that is the French decision, also the decision of the National Assembly, which was not then shared by the Senate and definitely not signed by the President, but did some harm. That was to punish people who reject to accept the Armenian genocide. And that in a context where in Turkey there was a discussion about freedom of expression. Yes. So it came together, the two discussions, you know, the European pressure towards Turkey saying you have to accept that people say this was a genocide and you cannot punish these people if you want to become a member. On the other side, having France saying, if you don't accept it was a genocide, we punish you. So you can imagine that this did not really support the moderate people in Turkey, to say the least. It helped really the hawks to say, well, if they do this, we can do it as well. So then a thing which has to do with our topic here from the Netherlands, which really concerned me, people of Turkish origin running for different parties for office in the Netherlands had to, in a way, confess that the Armenian genocide took place in order to be placed on the party lists. Don't get me wrong, if somebody is doing foreign policy, it's perfectly right to ask him or her, what is your opinion about the Armenian genocide? But if somebody is doing agricultural policy, just because he or she happens to be of Turkish origin, why should he or she, you know, talk about the Armenian genocide? I mean, if you follow this logic, you end up in a very, very dangerous direction, because then you have to look into the ethnic roots of everybody and have to look into the history of that country. You certainly will find something and then make a test with him or her. And, you know, I hope you understand what I'm talking about. Having said that, I don't share the official view of Turkey towards the Armenian question. Certainly not. Hrant Dink, the murdered journalist in Istanbul, was more than a friend to me. He was like a brother to me. And I'm a strong criticizer of the official Turkish position. But I have a feeling, bless you, that the discussion in Europe does certainly not help Turkey to open the discussion. It's the opposite of what's happening. That's why I'm so concerned with the debate that is taking place in Europe, and by the way also of a potential decision in the US Senate about that, in the House. Immigration from Turkey, you have to know that the negotiation process with Turkey, the first time in the history of enlargement to the European Union, is completely different when it comes to movement of labor. Until now, we always had an exclusion of Mediterranean or Eastern European countries for some years of free labor, free movement of labor. It was maximum 7 years for the Eastern European states. The first time with Turkey, we have not given any figure about that. It's completely open. It's completely depending on the economic situation in Turkey. Why is that? Because the European politicians wanted to safeguard that if in 7 years from now the economic situation in Turkey would be still bad, that there is no, you know, forcement to say now you have to accept everybody. And of course the main goal was to, in a way, calm down all the concerns in the European public opinion that millions of people from Turkey are about to move to Europe once Turkey enters the European Union. So this is very important to understand, that this concern, what a lot of people in Europe have, is in a way not justified, because even if Turkey in 10 or 15 years from now would enter the European Union, of course it has to be a different Turkey from today when it comes to the economic situation in Turkey. Still then, people in Turkey would not have the right to move to any of the member states. for an unforeseeable time.
Mark or Shani?
Sure, I have a question for Ishani. Two questions, actually. One is that, could you tell us how the, what migration route or what mechanism do Hindus from Bangladesh use to come to the United States? Do they go through the immigration program, through the refugee program, through the asylum program? And then how are they supported by the Hindu Bangladeshi community in the United States? And the second question is, as you know, under the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, the President designates countries of particular concern for severe, egregious, and systematic violations of religious freedom. And the countries that are currently so designated are Sudan, Eritrea, North Korea, I believe Uzbekistan now, Iran, China, and Saudi Arabia. Bangladesh has not been designated. Has your community advocated for their designation as a CPC, and why do you feel it hasn't been designated as such?
Great questions, first of all. In terms of migration routes, for coming to the United States, it falls under two categories from what I've been able to find out. The first is they come here through political asylum, seeking religious or political asylum. And the second is the United States has a lottery program to allow many countries to come in through a lottery system. And a lot of Bangladeshi Hindus have, through this lottery program, been able to come to the United States. So that's one way. From the local Hindu population, unfortunately, the Bangladeshi population is not that economically well off because of the fact that most of them are refugees and they work low labor jobs. So there has not been much of a support from the local community, but you do see support from Bengali Hindus from the Indian side who understand what is going on in Bangladesh and to the Hindus there because they have been or their parents have been directly affected by it, so they're more sympathetic to the cause. And it could be something simple as helping them find housing through shared housing somewhere or helping them find local jobs in areas. But there is not any such thing as like a local community center to that degree. In terms of the countries of particular concern, unfortunately, the only people that have been advocating for the Bangladeshis are the Bangladeshis themselves in the United States. And there aren't that many, that much compared to how much has actually fled off, because the majority have gone to India and are flooding the states of West Bengal. But the ones that are here, again, are not very economically well off, so it's very difficult for them to come mostly from New York City to make trips here and try to get appointments. And the other thing we do see is, it takes time to make change in government, as always. It doesn't really happen overnight. And this is something that has really come to the light of the USCIRF or the State Department through the Bangladeshi community for the past, say, 5 to 6 years, and from our organization about for the past 3 to 4 years. This is our second report. The first report we published was 2 years ago, and we're publishing a 2006 report, which is having its press release in June. We're at the final stages of it right now. But considering the magnitude of what is happening there, 30% to less than 10%, that's a huge amount. For example, I have a quote actually that according to Salim Samad, he's actually a journalist and a human rights worker that actually lives in Canada right now. He's there as a political asylum. He says, the Hindu population, according to general trends of population growth in Bangladesh, in '91 it should have been 32.5 million, but it actually is 12.5 million. So there are 20 million missing. So considering that 20 million missing, and we are getting hundreds of reports a year and are working with on-the-ground human rights groups, we feel it's incredibly important that Bangladesh be considered a country of particular concern.
I have a question to Ishani as well. I think one of the most fascinating areas is to see what happens if you move to another country and you have conflicts in the country of origin. How does that transform into the new country? So since you asked about the Armenian-Turkish conflict, I'm not a Turkish citizen, I'm a German citizen, and I'm a member of parliament from Germany, but I'm of Turkish origin. So I try to feel obliged in a way also to, go to reach out to the Armenian community in Europe and in Germany in order to show, I'm not a monster, and, we live here, and let's try to find things that we share. So my question to you is, is there some kind of contact between Bangladeshis of Hindu origin or of Muslim origin in the US? Do you work together? Do you come together? Do you discuss? Are there some official meetings? How's that?
Most of the people that have been very sympathetic to the cause in Bangladesh, in terms of Bangladeshi Muslims, have been journalists and have been human rights workers that are there. And a lot of them are living in the United States or in Canada. One of them is Salim Samad. The other one, everyone may know, is Taslima Nasreen, who wrote her book, Shame. She wrote it right after the destruction of the Babri Mosque in, I think it was 91 or 94. So she's actually she had lived in Europe for a while, now she lives in India. We regularly come across journalists who are very sympathetic to the cause and who go back to Bangladesh to document what is happening there and write reports and have videos. Chowdhury Kabir is another one that we actually work with. So in terms of people who are actually very sympathetic and try to reach out to the Hindu community, these journalists and human rights workers actually have set up funds for the Hindus that are there that have faced persecution. For example, I know Chowdhury Kabir actually sponsored 6 young girls. The youngest was about 8, the oldest I would say about 15, who were victims of rape and gang rape. So he's actually sponsoring them and putting them through school and taking care of them. So that's one level. And in another way, unfortunately, I think when I went to the USCRF policy briefing in November, you could pretty much still see the level of hostility between the Hindus and the Bangladeshi Muslims. And it was very evident through a very vociferous debate that went on before and after the hearing on why there should be a policy brief or shouldn't be a policy brief, or this is just not true or this is true. So there's still a little bit of contention in that area.
Why don't we open this to questions and comments from the audience? There is a microphone in the center. And if you'll introduce yourselves before you ask the question. I think this is probably something that everyone on the panel would have something to say about.
Well, thanks for the question. Let me try to answer the question as far as I'm able to. We have a debate about whether the state should respond with firm policy or whether it should respond more with a liberal policy. You can see that certainly in the UK, you can see that in Germany and a lot of countries, how to react. Then the second area, which is now more or less in all the European countries where you have large Muslim communities, is should the state sponsor its partners? Should the state even go so far to create its partners? Or is that leading to, even to poison the situation and make it worse? Or, which I would rather prefer, should the state find an indirect way to support the ones who should be supported and more help the communities to feel as part of the society, make it easy to have access to the society, and mainly don't oversee the socioeconomic factors, which I see as a very big danger in Europe right now, that we see this one-dimensional track towards Islam and oversee completely the dimension vis-à-vis education. That's particularly true for Germany and for France, and of course the question of unemployment. Then the next question, which is very important in that question, in that context, is who is the enemy we're talking about? Is the enemy the religious person? Is the enemy the one who goes into the mosque or not? Certainly for me not, because if we draw the line there, then you have a huge enemy and you're not going to win this. So, and by the way, also research shows us that the ones who become terrorists are not the ones, who are organized in local mosques, and go to the mosque service. They're not the group we should really target. Having said that, that doesn't mean that there are not views that we should question vis-à-vis gender questions and so on. But that's a modernization phenomena, not a terrorism phenomena. We should really be careful when we talk about that. And my colleagues, unfortunately, and a lot of media doesn't do that. They mix it up permanently. And one final remark to that, which is And that's where the difference between the US and Europe is. Europe is going towards a more and more secular orientation. You can certainly see that on the Protestant camp, to a lesser degree maybe on the Catholic side. And then you have these mosques full and crowded, and you perceive this as a threat. You perceive this as a threat towards your lifestyles, you perceive this as a threat towards your religion, towards what you've accomplished in the society. And then you also have new coalitions, which are very important to understand, between conservatives and liberals. Conservatives traditionally skeptical vis-à-vis Islam migrants, liberals who used to be on the other side but see conservative Muslim migrants as a threat to what they've achieved when it comes to women's rights, when it comes to gays and lesbians, and other liberal achievements in a society. And this is a situation that we're facing right now. So to make a long story short, the expectation, not always outspoken, but you can hear it when you read between the lines, is if you want to be a good citizen, you should really become an atheist Muslim. This is a new category we've just established. You know, there are atheists and atheist Muslims in order to distinguish the difference. That is in a way the expectation. Because if you're a believer, there is always some kind of poison in you that one day might lead you into a dangerous path. And even if it would be true, which it certainly is not for me, but even if it would be true, does that really help us? I mean, what does follow from that line if you think through it? Either you have to deport all the Muslims or you have to convert all them. Both is not very likely to happen. So isn't it more realistic to support all those people inside the communities who try to be good citizens, who say that it's no contradiction to be a Muslim and a good French, a good German, a good Dutch or whatever citizen? And I would certainly say this is what we have to concentrate on, but the minds are not really clear in Europe about that.
I really like your repeated comments about differentiation of what we mean by a Muslim. I'd like to say two things. One, we read in the newspaper every day about the Sunnis and the Shias and all the conflicts in Iraq. I'm not sure that that's really religious. It seems to me, I teach a course at the University of Houston in which I try to get students to tease out what's religious about a lot of these conflicts in the world. We take things like Northern Ireland. We talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. And we try to look at what we use religious terms like Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland. But is it really religious conflict? It certainly isn't doctrinal. It certainly isn't ritual. But those words mask all kind of political and economic realities and socioeconomic differences between the groups. It seems to me the same thing's happening in Iraq. We talk about the conflict between the Sunnis and the Shias and the Kurds. But is it really doctrinal differences? Is it really religious differences in terms of teachings and whatever? Or is that simply masking decades and decades of regional and clan and tribal conflicts that are going on? So I think even use of these kind of terms is very confusing. Second point, so I really like the idea of differentiating what we mean by different terms. And what is Islam? I mean, every Muslim is not alike, as you say. They're atheistic Muslims, they're agnostic Muslims, they're all kinds of Muslims. But in the United States, 10 years ago, how many of you knew a Muslim? How many of you had really sat down and talked to a Muslim, eyeball to eyeball? A lot of Americans hadn't, and many Americans still haven't. But it's becoming more common. And I think until we can look at Muslims as human beings and as varied as, you know, we German Americans are in this country, we're not going to get very far. Second point I want to make has to do with the media. I was in Turkey about a year ago, and I had breakfast with an imam who was on his way to the State Department to meet with Condoleezza Rice. And I asked him the question I asked so many Muslims.
He was a Muslim leader.
Yeah.
I think she spends 90% of her time meeting Muslims.
And I said to him, I said,
won't help.
look, you're a moderate voice in Islam. I said, why aren't you people confronting the fundamentalists? Where's the moderate voice of Islam? How come everything we see in the media is fundamentalist? I said, where are the moderate voices? And he looked at me and he said, Dr. Ebaugh, in the 4 hours after 9/11, I was interviewed by 4 of the major media, TV stations. He said, I gave almost 4 hours of testimony of the moderate position on this. He said 20 seconds was aired in the media. He said, the media in this country they're not open to the moderate voice. He said, I try continuously to try to get the moderate voice into this discussion. But he said, you won't believe how hard it is. That doesn't make news.
Sure. I think one area we have to talk about when we're talking about refugee populations and displaced populations is really education. What fundamentalists have done is they have managed to target disaffected, displaced populations, especially in refugee contexts, and given them things that nobody else can give them, which is access to an education, which is a sense of dignity. And this is something we saw in Pakistan with regard to Afghan refugees and the madrasas that resulted in many of the Taliban leaders. We're seeing it now to an extent in Bangladesh with the Rohingya in the camps there. There is no refugee population in the world, in my opinion, which is in a worse situation and in a more prolonged and more horrific situation than the Rohingya Muslims who are from Burma and have found very, very tenuous refuge in Bangladesh. And again, they are being targeted by fundamentalists who are offering them, you know, something which they can't get in Bangladesh, which is something of an education. It's illegal for Rohingya refugees to even learn Bangladeshi when they're in the camps. The Bangladeshi government has made sure that they have no rights and no actual access to education. So what they are deprived of, the fundamentalists try to make up for. So I think the international community really has to do a better effort in terms of making sure that displaced populations receive an education and receive attention that they need and that they deserve. Otherwise, you're leaving them ripe to be picked by other forces.
My voice is going, sorry. One area that I've seen is, I'd have to echo a lot what Mark had said, is the fact that, unfortunately, with countries like Bangladesh, where there are repeated floods and a lot of lack of education internally, people that are coming from abroad who are guest workers, who are Bangladeshi, who go abroad to the Gulf countries, come back as guest workers, they come back with a stronger sense of identity in terms of religion. And they try to educate, unfortunately, a population that is already very uneducated on religion. So the population that's there is pretty much ripe for the picking. They have a person who was maybe a poor farmer 2 years ago who comes back with lots of money and starts speaking about religion to a population that doesn't know anything about religion or has no education. It's only a matter of time that it will affect the minority population, considering that the government themselves are not really helping the minority population through its various laws. If you look at Bangladesh's structure and government, you will find virtually no Hindus in higher offices in, say, the military or in the judiciary or in higher government rankings. So if you're already being discriminated against in the government, and then you have people who have all of a sudden acquired an education from abroad and now are pretty much telling you that you do not deserve to live in this country, it's only a matter of time that you're going to flee abroad. So it's important that basically all the countries of the world, especially the Western countries, really take into light the importance of education for all people around the world.
Hi, my name is Kevin Boyd. I'm a junior in the School of Foreign Service and a culture and politics major, and specifically kind of focused on German-Turkish relations. So you have to forgive me for asking something that's not entirely germane to the discussion. But I've been researching a lot recently the unfortunate murder of Hrant Dink and also the killings last week in Malatya, Turkey. And one of the things I've noticed in a lot of the German press and a lot of the main German news websites is that in the articles about these topics, there's often a direct mention of, for example, freedom of expression or freedom of religion. And I was wondering to what extent you personally see these unfortunate killings as an expression of Turkish policy failures, and to what extent the EU sees them as Turkish policy failures. Thank you.
Well, thanks for the question. I wrote a piece, by the way, about the horrible killings of Malatya. It's in Spiegel Online, and only German, but I think it gets translated these days into the English issue of Spiegel Online. First of all, I think it's wrong to portray this, and there's a lot to criticize with the current Turkish government. There's really a long list of things which they haven't done enough, haven't done quick enough, haven't responded enough. But it would be wrong to draw a line between the government and its position to what happened in Malatya. That's seriously, I think, unfair, which happened in some of the papers. There is another point to make, and that is that the government's lack of strength in following up of recent events like that before. Remember in Trabzon when the Catholic priest was killed, or remember what happened in Şemdinli when a bomb exploded in a Kurdish village, and it was very clear that there was a link to the security forces. The car was from the security forces. A list with names of good and bad people was found in the car, and the prosecutor who followed up the case said the link goes directly to the state and gave a name of the now chief of the security forces in Turkey. And what happened was the prosecutor was prosecuted. He lost his job. And after that, what happened was the killing of Hrant Dink, the Armenian Turkish journalist. Again, 11 people are now in prison. And I have a feeling that the prosecutor thinks that's it. But to me, the real process starts, because you have to follow the link which goes to a religious nationalist party called the Büyük Birlik Partisi. You have to follow the link that there were serious informations about that this is going to happen. Who knew that? What happened with this information? Why was this information not transformed into action? And some other things I don't want to talk here about, some other links that people follow up. And it's very clear, if there is no signal coming from Ankara, from the government to the state prosecutors, we are behind you, and we stand behind you wherever this goes to. And even if it goes to the people with uniforms, even if it goes to people that work in the state, even if it goes wherever, we are behind you, nothing will happen. So in a way, my answer to your question is, if you want to have a different Turkey from today, and if you really want to make sure that this doesn't happen in the future anymore, that things happen and you ask yourself, how could this happen? How does an organization like Hezbollah, which was cracked, suddenly appears again and then disappears again? How can they make this? Did they make it of their own, or were there some other people who helped them? If you want to find a final solution to that, the only way to that is that the state has to make, the government, has to make clear its mind where it really wants to follow these cases, whether it has the strength to. And now I'm again on the European camp. Let me say it very clear. The less likely it is that Turkey joins the European Union, the less courageous the government is. Yes. The more likely it is that they join the European Union, the more courageous they are. So if Europe criticizes the involvement of the people in uniform into politics, it's very easy. Europe has a direct say on that. The more it is clear that Turkey, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day will join the European Union, the less interference of military people you see into politics. The less likely it gets, that Turkey joins, the more interference into politics you see. So this is something people sometimes oversee, that this is not only a power game inside Turkey, but we as Europeans, and certainly if the US, with a new leadership that is hopefully then becoming more popular again in the world, like the previous leadership used to be, they have a say on this as well. This is not only a fight between those powers in Turkey.
May I follow one issue with that? With the upcoming elections in Turkey, Tim, what is your sense if this more religious leadership gets into office? If there's a leadership that comes into office that's more open toward religious issues, perhaps, what impact do you think that's going to have on these questions?
I don't want to monopolize now the Turkey debate, so very briefly on this. I mean, isn't that an irony? I come from a secular family. My mother was always a supporter of the GHP, which is now the opposition party in the parliament, which pretends to be social democrat. To my opinion, it's an ultra-nationalist populist party. And you have the religious guys in power. And, you know, I come from a totally different side. But I find more in common with those people who are now in power in Turkey than the so-called secular, so-called left opposition. Let me give you one example. When it comes to religious foundations, the foundations of the Christian and Jewish minorities, those people who are now ruling Turkey, who come from the religious side, from the Muslim religious side, they established legislation which is more liberal towards religious foundations of the religious minorities. He was opposed by the so-called secular opposition, and by the way, by the current president of Turkey. So this is something we have to understand. But now, to be fair, I have to say that the criticism of those who did not support that said, well, they don't do it because they like the Christians. They only do it because they want to give more freedom to the Christians, and then in that context enjoy more freedom for themselves and for their own people. So then making sure that on the long term they have their hidden agenda, which is the Islamization of Turkey. This is the debate you have in Turkey. So to sum up, whatever you do, it's wrong. If the people in power, you know, say, well, we don't have a problem with reopening of the Halki seminary in the Marmara Sea for the Greek Orthodox Christians in Turkey, everybody says, or the secular people, the laicite people say, well, come on, they are only doing that because their real goal is they want to have their own religious schools. That's why they love the Greeks. But what happens then? Nothing happens. So nobody gets religious freedom. That certainly cannot be the solution. So what Turkey needs is really some kind of consensus of the different wings of its societies, which unites in an umbrella of a more democracy and more freedom for religious expressions. That includes certainly Christian belief, but that also includes the Sunni belief and one side where the AKP has a problem, which is completely out of the picture. You know, the AKP does not have a strong problem, the ruling party, with Christians, because Christians are a very small minority. There is no danger that they ask for power or something because they're so small. But where they have to modernize themselves is with their own minorities. That's a real task for them. The Alawis, for instance. You know, this is the real proof of modernization. Do the Sunni political Muslims in Turkey accept that there are other people belonging to the majority who have a completely different interpretation of the religion, who don't want to go to mosques? Do they accept their belief as first-class belief as well? Or do they say, well, we only accept Christians and Jews because they're small minorities, but with Alawis we have a problem?
Thank you. I'm going to take a few questions and then come back and particularly so that this isn't just Cem speaking. Yes.
Hi, I'm Catherine Pitch. I'm a master's student in the Arab Studies program here, and I'm also an assistant on the Carnegie Project on Reformist Islam. I'd like to maybe offer a counter-narrative to some of the questions and comments that are made by the panelists and other questioners, which goes to the question of fundamentalism. The project that I work on very much focuses on interreligious dialogue and also cooperation. This is in the United States, in Europe, in Southeast Asia, and South Asia, the Arab East, and also North Africa. And I guess that one of the focuses of our project is really looking at interreligious cooperation. So while, I mean, a major theme of the panel has been kind of how either IDPs are manipulated by fundamentalist elements or the threat that fundamentalism presents to these people that are in this unique social and economic and political situation, there's also cooperation that's taking place. And as for my questions, I have two questions for Ms. Chowdhury, which are first, to what degree have the changing demographics of the Bangladeshi Hindu population been a result of increasing demographic, like increasing trends in birth rates and things like that among the Muslim population there. To what degree is it a factor of migration? And then the follow-up to that, to what degree is the migration forced or voluntary out of Bangladesh into either the United States or into India? Thank you.
One more and then we'll.
Yes. My name is Albert Ebaugh. I am the husband of Helen Rose Ebaugh. And so we travel around quite a bit. I'm a psychiatrist and I'm retired, so that gives me a lot of flexibility. One of the things I've noticed in going to these conferences, and I'd like to address the question of the Muslim population. Been to many conferences involving Muslims in the United States, and they tend to focus on Abraham as a central figure for the Christians, the Jews, and the Muslims. And I think that's fine. You know, on the surface, that's great. They focus on Abraham as the father of us all, and gosh, that covers a broad territory of the world. You know, that leaves out, I mean, that's a huge chunk of Europe and the Middle East and the United States. You know, in a way, to me, though, it seems like a safe topic to talk about Abraham, because Abraham was, what was he, Lord, 1500 BC? What was it? Quite many years ago, I forget. And then later, we talk about Rumi, who is 13th century, the poet Rumi. You know, I think that's all fine and good to focus on historical persons like William Shakespeare or the poet Rumi or Abraham or whatever. That's nice because they have a unifying effect to the world's populations. What I've noticed about Rumi, for example, is that Rumi does not take sides in Islam, but he tends to be a unifying force as a poet because it gets away from the legalisms of the fundamentalists. It gets away from the legalisms in the Jewish component. It gets away from the legalisms of the Christian component. So, you know, it's great in a way to focus on Rumi. I don't know whether you realize it or not, but he's one of the best-selling poets in the United States. And I think that's great. Now, what can we do, though, when we get down to the nitty-gritty of human relationships and we bring it down from the abstract into the particular? How do you know, I think a lot of this covers, it serves as an avoidance mechanism to the real issues of politics. What can we do about that part of it, or the economic part of it? Thank you.
Okay. Well, I certainly share what was said about political criteria with the negotiations with Turkey. That's maybe the most crucial point. Turkey has achieved a lot there with capital punishment. By the way, this would be a reason why the U.S. could not join the European Union if the U.S. would, even if it would be geographically closer to Europe, which it is not. For us, it's a very crucial point when it comes to our understanding of our values. And a lot of other points which have changed in Turkey. The Kurdish question, let me describe it this way. When 15 years back, when I was in Turkey in interviews or on TV, before the program started, I always asked the moderator about the current wording. What is the kind of words I should avoid? What is the kind of word I should use? Not because I was concerned for myself, but I was concerned for the other guy because I'm going back to Germany. But this guy has to stay there and it's his job. So he said, like, well, don't use the word Kurdish. I said, like, so what do you want me to describe these people? What shall I use, you know? Well, Southeastern and so on. So there was this strange way of dealing with a problem which is obviously there. Today, it's very normal to have discussions about the Kurdish question on all TV channels. even the public TV today, that was the last, you know, safeguard of the state people, where you had to avoid these kinds of words, and even there you can hear the word. Again, that didn't happen because, you know, Turkish politicians thought it's a great thing. It happened because of the European Union. Let's be frank with that. It happened because it's clear the European Union wants that, and a lot of people in Turkey who always fought for that couldn't do that in their society without the help of Europe. So it was a great way of cooperation. We supported civil society, we supported modernizers in Turkey and made sure that they could do that. With the restart of violence, unfortunately, and terrorism, unfortunately that backfired the whole debate, and I think the Cyprus question, I want to repeat that, has an impact on that. Because if Cyprus would have been a success story, it would have strengthened and would have made stronger those who say, listen, you can make a deal with the Europeans. They promised, we've solved one problem, now let's continue with the other problem. So in a way that was unfortunately a tremendous turning point for reforms in Turkey. And currently, unfortunately, you have the Iraq debate playing into the whole Kurdish question. For always, I doubt the official position of the Turkish hawks who said, you know, if you start to give them rights, it will end up in separation. The first time, I would say, they have a point, but different from what they think. Because of the Iraq question, because in northern Iraq there is a Kurdish airline, there is some kind of Kurdish entity, there is a Kurdish parliament, there's Kurdish TV and so on, and people in the Turkish southeast follow that very closely. If Turkey doesn't come to grips with its Kurdish minority, they're about to lose their hearts and minds. I would have never said that 10 years ago, because there was no alternative for the people of Kurdish origin. Today there is an alternative. Maybe in theory, but there is an alternative. So I think it's extremely important for Turkish policymakers to really understand that they have to reach out to the hearts and minds of the people and win them back, which is not impossible. But therefore it's clear that what has been done so far is not enough. Part of that should be that children should have the right to learn Kurdish as well as the official language, which is Turkish. You know, you cannot ask Turkish in Germany for Turkish children, which I support, but then say, but spoken languages in Turkey should not be educated in the state curriculum. That's not possible. That's a no-starter. The same is true for Kurdish TV. You know, you have Kurdish TV, but no Kurdish news, because for Kurdish news you have to apply in Ankara 1 week before. I mean, imagine a news program where you have to apply 1 week before, you know, and then 1 week after you tell what happened the last week. I mean, again, this is policy that goes back to the old thinking that you somehow have to control these strange people because language is connected to separatism. And Turkey has to cut that link. Language is first of all culture. And if they achieve that, there is a solution. I have serious concerns with northern Iraq, but these concerns unfortunately also involve the foreign policy of this country and of course Europe as well, that Abrahamic dialogue or the Rumi Forum, first of all, I think this is very important and it's a good thing to be sure on that. On the other side, sometimes the levels of dialogue are mixed up. The levels of dialogue are not, you know, Western politicians and Muslim scholars. That's the wrong level of dialogue. But that's what's happening right now. The right level would be, you know, people of belief of the different religions together, that they have a dialogue about, you know, is Abraham more Muslim or more Jewish or more Christian or not at all, or whatever. Let them discuss that. It's their discussion. It's not my discussion. I listened to it. I found it exciting. I found it fascinating. I love to listen. I love to read Rumi or Mevlana, how we call him. I love to read Yunus Emre. I love to read Hacı Bektaş. And I would love that, you know, this would be taught more in Turkey, because I think you would get less 17-year-old murderers who kill Armenian journalists if they would all read Rumi. Somebody who reads Rumi and understands Rumi does not kill an Armenian journalist. The problem is that, unfortunately, students in Turkey don't read and understand Rumi anymore. But that's another topic. So I think the level should be religious people together with religious people, and this is the main task, religious Muslims or Muslims of belief with other Muslims who have different opinions. Secular Muslims and non-secular Muslims have to talk to each other. Alawis and Sunnis have to talk to each other. That's the main task, what is really needed. And that's not really what's happening, unfortunately. So, you know, it stays on a superficial level between convinced people who talk to convinced people. But that's not, you know, what brings us forward. What we really need is the tough guys on the different sides. They have to come together and talk to each other and find a minimum level of understanding. You know, that doesn't mean that we all have to love each other. I don't believe in that kind of dialogue that much. It doesn't mean, you know, that Alawis have to become Sunnis and vice versa. What it means is that I accept you the way you are and you accept me the way you are. People who fight for the right to wear the not the hijab, but the headscarf. I come from a secular family where nobody has a headscarf. But I support their right. I think it's wrong that students cannot go to university because they want to wear the headscarf. Where does it lead us to? That they don't study? Is that a good thing? I'm not really convinced that that's a good thing. So I fight for their right, even that I have a completely different background and my mother thinks I'm crazy. My mother says I'm too naive. I don't see the hidden agenda of them. But on the other side, I want them to also fight for the right of Muslim women not to wear the headscarf. And not, you know, in Istanbul, there it's easy. I want them to fight in Van, where it's much tougher to do that. I want them to fight in Fatih in Istanbul, you know, in a Muslim neighborhood where it's really extreme conservative people. There they have to educate their own people. And then we can really talk about dialogue. That's real dialogue.
Ishani?
Some of the questions you brought up were excellent, and actually your birth rate question is going to be addressed in the 2006 report, which is actually being worked on right now, which I don't have a copy of because it's being edited. But what I can give you at this point is the 91 statistic, which I had spoken about before, which according to normal birth trend in the area, there should have been 32.5 million Hindus, but the population was 12.5 million. So that is the hard stat that I can give you at this point. In regards to voluntary migration, there definitely is voluntary migration. Everybody wants to move to a better country for economic purposes, to, you know, have a better lifestyle. But unfortunately, the people that I've come across, not only in India, because my family does live in Calcutta, which is in West Bengal, and I had a chance to visit a few weeks ago, but also in the New York area, I have found very little, if at all, people who are coming here because they really want to. They're basically coming here because they really have to. To the point where in India, the borders are pretty porous. There's not really much of a fencing there, but there are border security guards there who pretty much shoot on sight if you do cross the border. So I have come across a couple of families living in the vicinities in and around Calcutta, where it's close to the Bangladesh border, where young girls are pretty much smuggled inside the country. Girls about like 13, 14 years old, which are pretty much targets for being kidnapped or raped. They're smuggled inside the border through various means, like at night they're smuggled in, or through bullock carts and means of trade, or if trucks are going through, they're smuggled in through trucks, because of the fact that they're going to be targets for this. And in the United States, those who have come across that are living in the Queens, Bronx area, you know, are mostly asylums and refugee seekers. I haven't, and again, you know, who've come in through the visa lottery program, I have not come across anyone that says, you know, United States was my ultimate destination. You know, Bangladesh, I don't want to live there anymore. And the sad fact of the matter is that despite the fact that they know that they are you know, very far away from any sort of violence, they really refuse to go back to Bangladesh because of the fear that they have there. They just do not want to return to their home country. And they're trying the best they can to either smuggle their relatives out to India or somehow try to get them here, which is a really sad predicament considering the fact that if, you know, generations and generations have lived there and your ancestors have lived there, and, you know, you have land there and you have your roots there, that you're all of a sudden cutting off ties because of this fear.
We'll take 2 more questions, and then Yvonne and Andy. 3 more questions.
My name is Alex G. I work with Susan in the Institute for the Study of International Migration. And I just want to follow up on the point that Dr. Ebaugh was bringing up, and I know that Cham has taken most of the Muslim-specific questions, so I'm going to ask everyone else. You asked, essentially, what about the moderate Muslim voices in countries around the world? My question is, how can the U.S., with its hardline stance and diminished international influence, how can the U.S. attempt to promote moderate Muslims around the world, in country?
Hi, I'm Andy Schoenholtz. I'm the Deputy Director of the Institute for the Study of International Migration. I want to thank all the panelists. It's been a great session. I have a couple specific questions, one to Dr. Ebaugh. That is, the research you're doing sounds really fascinating, especially when you started talking about the changing roles of women in terms of how immigrants who come to the United States are, in a sense, working together with their communities back home. And I was wondering if you found anything with regards to outreach to other religious communities or ethnic groups. You know how that takes place in the United States. There's a good deal of interfaith communication, let's say, and it's also between ethnic groups. It's not just about religion per se. And I was wondering if your research has turned up any evidence of that also occurring abroad, if those here are bringing that back home in some sense. And I had a couple questions for our parliamentarian. First, you started off talking about the statistics and the perceptions of Muslims in Europe. So the question really is about how to address that. What do you think states and civil society in Europe in particular should be doing about those perceptions? And the second is, you talked about the Dutch party requirements, a certain litmus test with regards to the Armenian genocide. So how do you read that that is what's being required? What does that tell you about the mentality, the stage of thinking about these issues, and has there been a reaction to that that suggests how problematic that is?
I'm Yvonne Haddad. I just dismantled this. My question is to Ms. Chowdhury. My research shows that, when we were living in Hartford, there were Bengalis who were both Hindu and Muslim. They got together more than, the Muslims went to Bengali events. They shared poetry and music and art, and they had nothing to do with the other Muslims, because the Pakistani Muslims were more conservative than the Bengali Muslims. So that I just wanted to let you know that there are places where they work together. The other thing is, I was wondering whether in your research you have included part of the Muslim narrative of how they are persecuted by Hindus, because you only gave one side of it. What is the reaction of Muslims in Bangladesh to the, what happened at Ayodhya, or what happens in Bombay, or some of the other places where Muslims are killed by Hindus, and what effect that has on Islamization in Pakistan and Bangladesh.
Why don't we start on this end and then go straight through?
Let me start with the question on interfaith dialogue in the United States. My position is there isn't much of it. Most interfaith dialogue is a panel like this, and you put an imam here, and a rabbi, and a Catholic priest, and a Buddhist monk, and I moderated many of these after 9/11. And you give them a topic, like terrorism or peace or whatever, and everybody says how their particular religious perspective deals with that issue, and I say, thank you, you've been a very cooperative panel, and we all shake hands and go home. That's not interfaith dialogue, and I don't do those kind of panels anymore, because I think sometimes, I mean, it may be educational, but sometimes I think in the name of interfaith dialogue, they do more harm than good, because you see the differences in the perspectives. Interfaith dialogue is, to really be effective, I think, really has to be dialogue. It has to get down to basic issues. I was at a conference Saturday where a woman presented the Muslim idea of Jesus and Mary and compared that to Christian ideas of Jesus and Mary. They are very different. Yes, the Muslims respect these religious figures, but they certainly don't look at them like Christians do. Until we get down to those kind of differences and can really dialogue about them, we're not really dialoguing. In terms of, so I would love to see some real interfaith dialogue going on in this country, but I think that we're just at the very beginning of that. In terms of how this is being reflected in other countries, I didn't see too much of this in the research that we did in these various other countries. It's mainly people of their own kind living together, but in terms of real dialogue between these communities, we did not see a whole lot of it. And I think until we really can build that model in the United States, we're not going to, in terms at least of its impact in these other countries.
I think the question I'm going to answer directly is the last one that was asked of me. There definitely is, as she pointed out, the woman over there, that there are instances where our Hindus and Muslims do get together. And what you are going to find is they're probably going to get together during two major important events. And one is the Bengali New Year, which just passed on April 14th. And that is the New Year that both Hindus and Muslims celebrate as the New Year for the Bengali calendar. So you are going to see events where they do get together. And the second is the celebration of a poet, Nazrul Islam, who was probably one of the most prominent spokespersons for interfaith dialogue during his time. He wrote a lot of poetry on Hinduism and Islam itself, and he's revered by both Hindus and Muslims. So if Hindus and Muslims can find such instances to get together and really work towards progress, perhaps we wouldn't see what we see in Bangladesh today. And the second question is in the perception of Muslims in regards to Hindus and the way Hindus are treating them. For example, if you look at India's population, in 1947, approximately 9% of the population in India was Muslim. In 2001, it's 13.12%. So you do see a rise in the population of Muslims in India. The second thing, there are instances, for example, in the Babri mosque destruction, where the mosque was destroyed. But a lot of things that are not highlighted are, if you look at Bangladesh, immediately after, the day after Babri Mosque, 300 temples were destroyed. But that never hit the major papers. 70 temples were destroyed in Pakistan. That never hit the papers either. So obviously, an eye for an eye makes the whole world go blind, is what we can see from this. It's when you take any religion to an extreme, in any interpretation, where you see such a rise in religious conflict, and eventually you're going to see the glorious history of that country centuries ago pretty much being disintegrated in the process.
Well, how to address the perceptions of Muslims? I'm not going to talk about what the state could do. I mean, I think I talked enough about that. Let me concentrate on what the communities themselves can do, and I think there's a lot to do. First of all, it is important that they realize that it's not enough to say, after 9/11, after London bombing, Madrid, to say, you know, we don't have anything to do with that because these people are not Muslims. That was the first reaction. Yes. I can understand that reaction because in a way, why should I take some kind of responsibility for people that also threaten my life? But it doesn't help us to reach out to the people because that's not what people want to hear, whether you like it or not. So you have to deal with the question, and there's no way to avoid it. That's the first thing I always tell when I visit mosques and discuss there. The second point is, it is very important that you describe yourself as part of the society in which you live. You're not in a diaspora. You're not the ambassador of the country of your forefathers. You are part of the society in which you live, and you have to describe yourself like that. Then you can expect the others to listen more carefully to what you say. That, I think, is one of the basic points. And that also includes a change of leadership. You need more people from the second, from the third generation, speaking the language of the country in which they live, knowing also the sensitivity of the country in which you live. That is, I think, one of the key points. And you need also, I think, creativity. That's what's really missing here. Let me give you one example. I suggested recently, I'm a Green MP, so I have to do that. I suggested recently, why do the mosques not build green mosques? Green not in the sense of religion, green in the sense of solar energy. Imagine the imam going up to the roof, you know, and building a solar energy panel. That's green, I like that, of course. You know, it would change the whole image, because it's, I believe in the surprise theory in policy. You have to surprise the others. Do what people don't expect you to do. Everybody would say, oh, look, they care for the things we care as well. They have the same kind of concerns that we have. Why don't the, you know, synagogues and churches and mosques race about who is more environmental friendly? Establish, you know, courses in your mosques about how to protect environment. There's not a single one, unfortunately, so far. This is in Germany, maybe here is. So I think this is really what you have to do. Participate in the discussions of the society in which you live. And one final thing I would like to share with you, which I recently heard from Berlin, from a local Muslim youth group. They came to me and said, you know, all these Christians, do you have as an address of Christians in Turkey? I said, why? What do you want to do with them? He said, well, we have the idea, because whenever we discuss, you know, about Islam and integration, they always say to us, but what happens to the Christians in the country where Muslims have the majority? So we thought, well, we have to talk to them. We don't know anything about that. We never learned something in our schools, in our books about them. So we want to have a partnership with them. You know, I think this is a great idea. Imagine, you know, Muslim communities in countries with Christian majority have some kind of, let's adopt a Christian community in a Muslim state, in a state with a Muslim majority, sorry. I think this would be a great thing, again, to change this kind of perceptions and to listen to how it is for them to be a minority in a surrounding situation of other majorities. How to react to what I described with the Netherlands and to that kind of mentality. I don't have an easy answer to that. I just want to give you a personal answer to that. For me, it was very clear when I decided to become a member of parliament. I had the opportunity to get back the Turkish citizenship. I got that offer even. I thought about it and I rejected it for a simple reason, because I thought if I do so, the reason why I'm telling you this is there's a discussion right now in the Netherlands about a lady who became a minister, has dual nationality, but is also in charge of migration. You come into danger, even if it's not true that people attack you and say you have second thoughts, you're not loyal to the country in which you live. This whole question of loyalty follows you if you have a name like I have a name. And if you live in a country that happens not to be a country with a long experience of being an immigrant country like the US is. So whether you like it or not, you have to address it. You know, just by not addressing it, it won't run away. So I think it follows you, and I hope that the next generation will have it easier if they experience each other as citizens and grow up with more normality, that it's something normal that a citizen of Germany or of the Netherlands is looking like me and has not a typical Dutch or a typical German name and is not a Protestant or a Catholic Christian. This is a question of time, and I'm very optimistic that on the long term this will change. But of course, I strongly believe the state has a lot to do here, but it's not enough to only wait for the state. The communities themselves also play a very important role. Let me finish by saying one of the most fascinating things is that this is a theory of mine, I hope I'm wrong, that some of the ethnic communities from Turkey living in Europe, what you see is what happened to Germans in Russia, you know, during Katharina the Great, who then became the Aussiedler, came back, and when they came back to Germany saying, you're not real Germans, because we're the real Germans. You look different, you talk different, you behave different, and so on. And this is a kind of thing that observe with some Turks in Germany and in Europe that they don't follow what's happening in Turkey and become more conservative abroad. I was recently in Turkey invited by the Foreign Affairs Minister, and Abdullah Gül, the Foreign Affairs Minister of Turkey, coming from a religious party. The previous party used to be a fundamentalist party, now Foreign Affairs Minister of Turkey, telling members of parliament from Europe of Turkish origin that they have to modernize themselves. Isn't that fascinating? I mean, this is a good example for globalization. You know, you see a foreign affairs minister coming from a very conservative religious wing, now being foreign affairs minister of Turkey, and telling Turks in Germany, I don't understand you guys. You look like coming from a village in the 60s of Turkey. I mean, don't you look to your neighbors? Don't you see that the world is changing? We've changed. Why don't you change?